The wind always seemed to whistle down Main Street in Dry Creek, carrying with it the dust of the open plains and the whispers of lives half-lived. Dry Creek wasn't much different from other frontier towns scattered across the Wild West. Just a row of weathered buildings, a saloon with doors that never stayed still, a sheriff's office with more cobwebs than lawmen, and a church whose bell rang on Sundays but not always on time. Life here was a hard bargain. A man worked his land from sunup to sundown, often with nothing but sweat to show for it. Women kept homes together with patchwork quilts, faith, and sheer stubbornness. What made Dry Creek different was its loneliness. The war, the raids, and the unforgiving wilderness had left more widows than brides, more orphans than mothers, and more men staring into their cups at the saloon than into the eyes of someone who loved them. Families were scarce, and laughter even scarcer. When children did run along the wooden sidewalks, their joy seemed out of place, like a bird singing in the middle of a storm. Mail-order brides had become something of a spectacle in Dry Creek. Word would spread when the stagecoach carried a young woman from the east, fresh-faced and hopeful, holding on to letters that promised a new life. The whole town would gather at the depot, some out of curiosity, some out of jealousy, and others, like the gamblers in the saloon, looking for entertainment. Most of the time, a man would step forward, nervous and eager, claiming the woman, who had risked everything to join him. Sometimes the pair looked relieved, their letters having painted at least a truthful picture. Other times, disappointment showed in their faces, and they knew they had been bound by desperation rather than affection. But there were darker moments, too. Once, a bride had arrived only to learn that her intended had died weeks before her journey. Another time, a man had drunk away his courage and never showed, leaving his bride-to-be trembling with shame while the whole town watched. Those were the kinds of memories Dry Creek carried like scars, and though folks rarely spoke of them, the silence was heavy whenever a new bride came on the coach. On this particular day, the air itself seemed restless. The stagecoach rattled into town, its wheels creaking, its horses sweating under the summer sun. Children pressed against the hitching posts, men leaned against walls with their thumbs hooked into their belts, and women adjusted their bonnets, as though they might catch a glimpse of their younger selves in the bride about to step off. The town wasn't cruel, but it was weary. Folks wanted hope, wanted to believe that life still offered second chances. And so they gathered, waiting, watching, whispering under their breaths about who she might belong to and whether her gamble would pay off. For them, it was something, between a story and a warning. For the bride, though, it was the turning of her whole life, though she didn't yet know whether it would turn toward joy or heartbreak. In the distance, a man sat alone on the porch of the general store, hat pulled, low, eyes hidden in shadow. He didn't move with the others, didn't join the chatter. His world was quieter, heavier, and he'd convinced himself he had no use for hope anymore. Still, when the stagecoach door swung open and a woman stepped down onto the dusty road, he couldn't help but lift his head, just enough to see the face of the stranger who had arrived in a town that seemed to have forgotten how to welcome anyone at all. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, its wheels sinking into the dust of Main Street, and the driver climbed down with a weary grunt. His calloused hand reached for the door, pulling it open with a creak. All eyes in Dry Creek seemed to hold their breath at once. Out stepped a young woman, her dress plain but carefully pressed, her bonnet tied neatly under her chin. She clutched a small valise, the kind that held all she owned in the world, and her eyes, though nervous, carried a flicker of determination. Her name was Eleanor Mayfield, though no one knew it yet. She had come all the way from Missouri, answering an advertisement in a newspaper that had promised a husband, a home, and a future in the wide frontier. The letters she'd exchanged had been short and plain, but they had spoken of a man with land, a steady income, and a need for companionship. She'd imagined herself cooking by a warm hearth, tending chickens, perhaps even raising children in the open air where there was more sky than walls. But now, as she stepped onto the dirt street and looked around, no one came forward. The driver cleared his throat, muttering, "This here's Dry Creek," before turning to unhitch the horses. His lack of ceremony cut deep. Eleanor shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her valise growing heavier by the second. She expected someone, anyone, to step forward, to call her name, to take her hand, but the crowd only watched. Curious eyes, pitying glances, whispered voices. Which one's here for her? A man in a sweat-stained hat muttered to his neighbor. "Don't look like anybody's claiming her," the other replied, his tone laced with unease. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster with each, passing second. She searched the faces, desperately trying to match one with the description from the letters. Broad-shouldered, brown-haired, with a ranch outside of town. But no one stepped forward. Minutes stretched into eternity. At last, the townsfolk began to shift. Some turned back toward the saloon, the novelty worn off. Others lingered only long enough to shake their heads. Whispers rose like smoke. "Shame. Poor thing. Guess he backed out. Or maybe there never was a man." Each word stung like a whip. Eleanor straightened her back, willing her spine to stay strong. She would not crumple under their stares. She had crossed miles of wilderness, survived long days on the stagecoach, and left behind everything familiar. If she had to face humiliation, too, she would face it with dignity. But dignity was a fragile shield, and already it was cracking. The sheriff, a tired-looking man with a badge that had lost its shine, approached her. He tipped his hat respectfully, but his eyes carried the same pity as the others. "Ma'am, if there's been some mistake, you're welcome to stay at the boarding house till you figure things out." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, softly, though her throat was tight. As the sheriff turned, Eleanor caught sight of a group of cowhands lingering near the livery stable. Their laughter was low, but their eyes were sharp and hungry. They looked at her as though she were not a person but a prize left unguarded. A shiver ran down her spine. No one had claimed her. That much was clear. The man who had written to her, whether coward, liar, or dead, was gone. She stood alone in a town that had no place for an unclaimed bride. Still, Eleanor refused to let tears fall. She lifted her chin and walked toward the boarding house, her valise bumping against her skirts. Behind her, the whispers followed like ghosts. What she didn't see was the rancher on the porch of the general store, his little girl peeking out from behind him. The man's eyes lingered on Eleanor's steady stride, his jaw tightening as, though a silent war was waging inside him. The girl's eyes, however, were different, curious, hopeful, and strangely certain. For while the town saw an abandoned bride, the little girl saw something else entirely. By the next morning, all of Dry Creek had heard the story. In towns like this, secrets traveled slower than dust, but gossip rode faster than a stallion. Eleanor Mayfield, the abandoned bride, as some already called her, was the subject. Of every whisper over morning coffee, every smirk passed across the saloon tables, and every sideways glance along Main Street. At the Golden Spur Saloon, the talk was loudest. The girls who worked there, painted in rouge and weary from nights spent with men too rough or too drunk, took particular interest. "Can you imagine?" one of them drawled, twirling a curl of her hair. "Travelin' all that way just to find. No man waitin'." Another laughed, though there was no kindness in it. Maybe she scared him off. Or maybe she made the whole thing up, just for a free ride out west. A third leaned close, her voice low but sharp. "Mark my words, a woman without a man in this town ain't safe for long. If no one claims her proper, someone will, and not in the way she wants." Their words slithered through the saloon like smoke, seeping into the ears of men already too eager for something to claim. By the blacksmith's forge, the talk had a different flavor. "Shame, really," old Henry muttered as he hammered iron into shape. "She looked steady, not like the flighty kind. Could have made a good wife for some lonely soul." His apprentice shrugged. Don't matter. Out here, if you ain't claimed, you're just, well, stray. The boy's word hung heavy in the air. Stray. As if Eleanor were nothing more than a lost dog waiting for someone to throw her scraps. Eleanor herself tried to ignore it. She had taken a small room at the boarding house, keeping her head down, and her hands busy. She mended her dress, washed what little she owned, and stared out the window at the endless horizon. Each night she prayed she would wake with some clarity, some direction. But each morning, the weight of her situation only grew. It wasn't just whispers she had to endure. On the third day, she stepped out to fetch water, only to find herself cornered by two cowhands near the well. Well, well, one drawled, his breath heavy with whiskey though it was still morning. Ain't it a shame you got no one to keep you, sweetheart? A pretty thing like you shouldn't be walking alone. The second grinned, his teeth yellowed. We could fix that problem for you, ain't that right? Eleanor's hand tightened around her bucket. Fear crawled up her spine, but she forced her voice steady. Step aside, gentlemen. I've work to do. The cowhand chuckled and leaned closer. Now, that ain't very hospitable. Maybe you ain't learned how things work in Dry Creek yet. Before they could press further, a shadow fell across them. The sheriff's voice cut through the air. That'll be enough. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, his gaze hard as iron. The cowhands grumbled but backed away, spitting in the dust as they went. Eleanor nodded her thanks, though her pride burned at having needed rescuing. The sheriff tipped his hat, but his words carried little comfort. Best be careful, ma'am. Folks get ideas out here. Ideas best stopped 'fore they start. That night, Eleanor sat by the window in her tiny room, staring at the stars scattered across the dark. Sky. She thought of her letters, of promises that had turned to smoke, of how quickly her life had shifted from hopeful to precarious. The whispers of scandal had already begun to paint her as less than respectable, and in a town like Dry Creek, a reputation once lost was near impossible to regain. What she didn't yet know was that while the saloon girls mocked, and the cowhands prowled, and the sheriff offered only wary protection, a pair of watchful eyes at the edge of town saw her differently. The rancher, silent as ever, had noticed the courage in her chin and the quiet strength in her defiance. But it was his daughter, the little girl with bright eyes, who saw something more. To her, Eleanor wasn't scandal or shame. She was possibility. Samuel Carter was a man of few words, and most of those he saved for his horses. Life on the frontier had hardened him, carved lines into his weathered face, and taught him that silence was often more reliable than promises. At 37, he owned one of the larger spreads outside of Dry Creek, 200 acres of pasture land, a herd of cattle, and a small house that was too quiet for its own good. Once that house had been filled with warmth. His wife, Clara, had carried laughter with her wherever she went, the kind that softened the edges of hard days. But the fever had taken her 5 winters ago, and nothing had sounded the same since. Samuel had buried his heart beside her grave, or at least that's what he told himself every night when he sat by the fire and listened to the emptiness pressing in. The only thing that kept him tethered to the world was his daughter, Lily. 6 years old, with a tumble of golden hair and eyes sharp as her mother's, she carried the innocence Samuel had thought lost forever. But even Lily's laughter, as sweet as it was, could not erase the shadow of grief that lived in him. He had sworn, quietly and firmly, that he would never remarry. To risk love again, only to lose it, felt like a cruelty he could not endure twice. Yet Samuel was not blind to the world around him. When the new bride had stepped off the stagecoach, valise in hand, he had noticed her. He had seen the strength in her posture, the determination in her eyes, even as whispers swirled around her like dust in the wind. And when no man stepped forward to claim her, Samuel had felt something stir inside, a sharp pang of pity, yes, but also something harder to name. For days he watched from a distance. While the town gossiped, while cowhands circled like vultures, Samuel kept his silence. He was not a man to act on impulse. Every decision he made was measured, weighed, and tested, like building a fence strong enough to hold against the storm. He told himself it wasn't his business. That woman, Eleanor, he had learned her name from the boarding house keeper, wasn't his responsibility. She had come for another man, not for him. But Lily saw things differently. Each time they went into town for supplies, Lily's eyes would stray toward Eleanor. She would tug at Samuel's sleeve, whispering questions he didn't want to answer. "Papa, why does she look so sad? Papa, why doesn't anyone sit with her? Papa, she looks lonely, like us." Samuel would grunt, deflect, and change the subject. But Lily's gaze never wavered. Children had a way of seeing truths that adults buried under pride and fear. And Lily had already made up her mind about Eleanor, though Samuel didn't yet know it. One evening, as Samuel sat on the porch sharpening his knife, Lily climbed into his lap. Her small hands rested on his chest and she leaned close. Her voice, barely more than a breath. "Papa," she said, her eyes earnest, "I think she's the one." Samuel froze. "The one what?" "The one to be my mama." The words hit Samuel harder than any fist could. For a long time he said nothing, staring out at the wide horizon as if it held the answer. His chest tightened with an ache he thought he had buried. He wanted to tell Lily no, to remind her of his vow, to shut down the hope before it grew. But when he looked into her eyes, so much like Clara's, he found he didn't have the strength. Instead, he said nothing at all. That night, as the crickets sang and the stars stretched endlessly above the ranch, Samuel Carter lay awake, torn, between the promise he had made to himself and the longing he saw reflected in his daughter's eyes. Lily Carter had grown up with more chores than toys. At 6, she could fetch water, gather eggs, and sweep the porch without being asked. She was bright, cheerful, and quick to laugh, but her laughter often echoed into silence, unanswered. Hina missed her mother in ways she couldn't fully put into words. Sometimes it was when she brushed her tangled hair and wished for gentle hands to smooth it. Other times, it was when she lay in bed at night and longed for someone to sing her to, sleep. Her papa loved her fiercely. She knew that. But Samuel's love was the kind that built fences and mended saddles, not the kind that rocked a child with lullabies. When Eleanor Mayfield stepped off that stagecoach, Lily's young heart seemed to recognize something instantly. Eleanor didn't just look lonely, she looked needed. And Lily, in her innocent wisdom, felt that she might be the one to fill the hollow spaces in both their lives. Over the next week, whenever Samuel took her into town, Lily found ways to drift closer to Eleanor. At the Mercantile, she lingered by the shelves near where Eleanor browsed. At the well, she offered to help carry a bucket, her small arms straining with determination. Each time, Eleanor smiled at her, and it was a smile Lily treasured. One afternoon, Lily plucked a wildflower from the side of the road and shyly offered it to Eleanor. The woman's eyes softened, and for a moment the weariness in her face lifted. She knelt down and tucked the bloom behind Lily's ear. "There," she whispered, "you look beautiful." It was the first time since her mother's death that Lily felt the warmth of such words. She carried that moment with her, holding it close like a secret treasure. That evening, Lily climbed onto her father's knee again. "Papa," she said, her voice stubborn, "she's the one. I picked her." Samuel tried to deflect, muttering about supper, but Lily pressed on. "You need her, I need her, and she needs us." Samuel's chest tightened because deep down, he knew his daughter wasn't wrong. It happened on a quiet morning, when the streets of Dry Creek were still drowsy from the night before. Eleanor sat on the edge of the boarding house porch, her valise by her side. She looked every bit the picture of abandonment, though her chin remained high. Lily, who had slipped away from her father's watch, padded up to Eleanor. She tugged, gently at her dress. Eleanor looked down, surprised, and found two earnest blue eyes staring up at her. "Miss Eleanor," Lily whispered, "I picked you for my daddy." The words struck like thunder in the silence. A few townsfolk nearby froze, their conversations dying in their throats. Eleanor blinked, stunned. Before she could answer, Lily added, "I don't want nobody else. I want you." Eleanor's heart squeezed. She had come west seeking a husband, but in that moment, it was the child's need that cut through her loneliness. She bent down, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, though her voice trembled. From across the street, Samuel stiffened. He hadn't meant for Lily to wander off, and he certainly hadn't expected her bold declaration. His jaw clenched, but something in his chest softened at the sight of Eleanor's hand resting gently on his daughter's cheek. The town held its breath. In that whisper, Lily had chosen. The question was, would her father? Samuel Carter wrestled with himself as he never had before. He was a man used to decisions, when to sell cattle, when to mend fences, when to draw his gun if needed. But this choice tore at him. On one side stood his vow. He had promised himself never to remarry, to spare himself and his daughter the pain of loss again. On the other side stood his child's clear need, her longing for a mother, and the undeniable fact that Eleanor Mayfield was a woman of strength and dignity in a place that sought to tear her down. He found himself watching her more closely in town, noting the way she carried herself despite whispers, the way she treated Lily with patience and kindness. She wasn't fragile. She was resilient. That resilience stirred something in him he had buried with Clara. But still, fear gnawed at him. What if he failed her? What if Eleanor grew to hate the life, to resent him, to regret staying in Dry Creek? What if Lily's heart broke all over? Again? Nights on the ranch grew restless. He walked the floor while Lily slept, staring out at the moonlit fields. The cattle lowed in the distance, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, but no answer came. The only certainty was this: if he did nothing, Eleanor would remain prey to the town's gossip and the dangerous men who circled closer each day. And Samuel Carter had never been the kind of man to stand by while the strong preyed on the vulnerable. The danger came sooner than expected. Late one evening, as Eleanor carried a basket from the boarding house, the same cowhands who had cornered her before stepped into her path. Their boots scuffed the dirt, their grins cruel. "Evenin', darlin'," one drawled. "We been thinkin'. Since no one's claimin' you proper, maybe you ought to consider us. Don't matter which, one of us'll do." Eleanor's stomach turned, but she held her ground. "Step aside," the men laughed. "Or what? Ain't nobody here to stand for you." But they were wrong. Samuel appeared, his revolver at his hip, his stance steady. "She's under my protection," he said, his voice like iron. The cowhands shifted uneasily. Everyone in Dry Creek knew Samuel Carter was a man who didn't bluff. His eyes burned with a quiet fury that promised consequences if they pressed. Further, the men muttered curses but slunk away, spitting into the dust. Eleanor's breath shook, though she tried to mask it. Samuel tipped his hat, his eyes meeting hers for longer than usual. For the first time, she saw not just a hardened widower, but a man willing to stand between her and the world's cruelty. And though neither spoke of it, something changed that night. It didn't happen quickly, but it happened surely. The town preacher, seeing the danger Eleanor faced, approached Samuel. "A woman alone here won't last. You know it. She needs a name, a home, a family. And your little girl, well, she's already chosen her." Samuel resisted at first. Marriage to him was sacred, not to be entered lightly. But Lily's steady insistence and Eleanor's quiet strength wore down his walls. One Sunday, beneath the shade of the churchyard cottonwood, Samuel finally took Eleanor's hand. "I won't make promises I can't keep," he said, "but I'll give you honesty, hard work, and a home. If that's enough, then stay. Eleanor's eyes shimmered. It's more than enough. With the town gathered, the preacher joined their hands and spoke the words. It wasn't a grand wedding, just a simple, honest union. But when Lily slipped her small hand into both of theirs, her smile brighter than the sun, Samuel felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, hope returned. The morning. After the wedding, Samuel hitched up the wagon. Eleanor climbed in, her belongings few but her heart full. Lily nestled between them, holding both their hands. As they rode out of town, the whispers of scandal faded behind them. Ahead stretched the wide horizon, endless and untamed. The Carter Ranch came into view, fences sturdy, fields golden, a house waiting not just for chores and silence, but for laughter and love. Eleanor looked at Samuel, his profile stern, yet softened by something new. He met her gaze briefly, then allowed himself a rare smile. For years, Samuel Carter had lived like a man with half a heart. Now, with Eleanor beside him and Lily between them, he felt whole again, and Eleanor, once abandoned, no longer felt unclaimed. She had not been chosen by the man who had written her letters. She had been chosen by a child's pure heart, and that choice had given her a family, a home, and a love far stronger than anything she had dared imagine. On the open frontier, under the wide, unbroken sky, 3 souls began again, not as strangers, not as broken pieces, but as a family.